Arrival and silent comparison. Have you ever stood in a completely new place and suddenly felt smaller than you really are? Not because someone insulted you. Not because you failed at something obvious. But because everyone around you seemed to know what they were doing while you were still translating the world inside your head. That was me on my first morning in the United States. The sky was wider than I expected. The air felt different on my skin, dry, a little cold, a little sharp. People walked fast, talked fast, ordered coffee fast. And there I was, standing in line at a small cafe, rehearsing one simple sentence in my head, "One coffee, please." I had practiced it all night. Still, my heart beat like I was about to take an exam. When it was my turn, the barista smiled and asked something I didn't fully catch. My brain froze. Not dramatically, just quietly. I smiled back, nodded a bit too much, and answered with the safest word I knew, "Yes." She laughed gently. I laughed too, even though I didn't know why. That moment didn't hurt. But something else started right there, very softly. Comparison. I compared my accent to hers. I compared my silence to everyone else's confidence. I compared my slow English to their fast, natural flow. Psychologists say the human brain is a prediction machine. It constantly scans the environment to answer one question: am I safe here? When the brain doesn't understand the language, the culture, or the social rules, it looks for shortcuts. One of its favorite shortcuts is comparison. Who is better than me? Who belongs here more than I do? Where do I rank? The problem is, your brain doesn't compare fairly. It compares your inside to other people's outside. That first week in America, I noticed everything. The way people talked about weather like it was small talk, not survival. The way neighbors smiled and said, "How are you?" without actually waiting for the answer. The way even children spoke English with a confidence I didn't have. I told myself, I'm just new. It's normal. But comparison doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. You should be better by now. They sound smarter than you. Why is this so easy for them and so hard for you? Climate made it worse in a strange way. Back home, weather felt familiar. Almost personal. In the US, seasons changed sharply, like switching channels. Summers were intense. Winters were clean and cold. Everything felt efficient, including people. Efficiency is great. But when you're learning a language, it can feel unforgiving. From a neuroscience perspective, learning a new language already puts your brain under cognitive load. You're translating sounds, grammar, and meaning in real time. Add social pressure and your amygdala, the fear center, gets involved. Once fear joins the conversation, comparison becomes louder. I remember driving through a quiet suburban street, houses lined up perfectly, lawns trimmed like they were measured with a ruler. I thought, everyone here has their life together. That thought felt real. It wasn't. But emotions don't care about facts. At night, I practice English by listening to slow videos. I repeated sentences out loud, quietly, so no one would hear my mistakes. I live in the United States. I am learning English. I am doing my best. Even then, comparison followed me. Online, people shared success stories. I became fluent in 6 months. My brain translated that into, "You're behind." Here's the quiet truth science supports. Comparison increases cortisol, the stress hormone. High cortisol makes memory worse. Memory is exactly what you need to learn a language. So the more you compare, the harder English becomes. And the harder English becomes, the more you compare. A perfect loop. A terrible one. But at that time, I didn't know this. I just felt tired. One evening, I stood by the window watching the sunset turn the sky orange and pink. It was beautiful. Objectively beautiful. And yet my first thought was, other people are probably enjoying this more than me. That was the moment I realized something important, even if I couldn't explain it yet. Comparison doesn't just steal confidence. It steals presence. You stop being where you are. You stop hearing what you're hearing. You stop learning at your own speed. You start living in an invisible race that nobody told you to join. If you're listening to this and you felt that same quiet heaviness while learning English, especially in a new country, there's nothing wrong with you. Your brain is doing what it evolved to do. It's just using an outdated tool in a modern situation. And the story doesn't end here. Because this was only the beginning of my life in America, of my relationship with English, and of a long lesson about comparison, joy, and self-worth. Not a dramatic beginning. A quiet one. The most dangerous kind. Weather, culture, and feeling small. The first real winter in the United States didn't ask for permission. It arrived like a decision already made, cold, clear, and firm. The air cut through my jacket in the morning, and every breath felt sharper, more serious, as if even oxygen had standards here. People didn't slow down. They adjusted. Thicker coats. Faster steps. Conversations that stayed short and practical, like everyone had somewhere important to be even if they didn't. I watched them from a distance, both impressed and uneasy, and without realizing it, the comparison quietly restarted. They looked prepared. I felt behind. Climate scientists say weather shapes behavior, but cultural psychologists go further. Climate shapes values. In colder regions, people often develop habits around planning, efficiency, and emotional self-control. None of this is bad. But when you come from somewhere warmer, both in temperature and communication, it can feel like walking into a room where everyone already knows the rules. I didn't. Simple interactions suddenly felt heavier. A neighbor asked, "Cold enough for you?" A cashier said, "Stay warm out there." Friendly phrases. Easy English. But my brain treated them like pop quizzes. Say something back. Say it clearly. Say it fast. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I didn't. When I didn't, I smiled too much. Smiling became my universal language. The cultural gap showed up in small ways. People valued personal space. They valued independence. They valued not needing help. Back home, closeness meant care. Here, distance meant respect. I compared myself again. Why do they seem so comfortable being alone? Why do I feel awkward in silence? Why does my voice sound smaller in English? Social comparison. Theory explains that we compare most intensely when we lack clear feedback. And in a new culture, feedback is rare. Nobody tells you you're doing okay. They just move on. Your brain fills in the blinks, and it rarely chooses kindness. I remember standing at a bus stop early one morning, snow covering the ground like a clean white screen. Everything was quiet, peaceful. Next to me, a man spoke on the phone, joking casually, switching topics without effort. His English rolled out naturally, like he had never doubted it for a second. I hadn't spoken all day. That silence felt loud. Language learners often think their biggest challenge is vocabulary or grammar. In reality, it's identity. When you speak a new language, you don't sound like yourself yet. You sound like a simplified version, a careful version. That gap hurts more than mistakes. At home, weather became emotional shorthand. Sunny days felt hopeful. Gray days felt like proof that I wasn't progressing. On colder afternoons, I stayed inside more. Less exposure. Less practice. And without meaning to, I trained my brain to associate English with discomfort. Neuroscience backs this up. Learning under stress reduces retention. High stress activates survival circuits, not curiosity. Comparison increases stress. Stress blocks learning. It's a perfect trap. I still studied. I listened to slow English. I repeated sentences. But every word carried pressure. I watched people talk effortlessly about weekend plans, school closures, road conditions. Local news became my listening practice. I understood about 60%, and instead of celebrating, I thought others would understand all of it. That sentence became a habit. Comparison doesn't shout. It repeats. Over time, though, something unexpected happened. I started noticing details others ignored. How people complained about winter, but also respected it. How shared discomfort created quiet bonds. How weather was the safest topic, neutral, equal, non-threatening. One afternoon, I commented on the cold to a cashier. My sentence wasn't perfect. My accent was obvious. She smiled and said, "Yeah. Winter here is no joke. No correction. No pause. No judgment. Just a response." From a psychological point of view, this was a micro-win. A moment of social safety. When your brain feels safe, it stops ranking you against others. That night, I realized something important. Culture shock wasn't a sign that I was weak. It was a sign that I was changing. You don't feel small because you're incapable. You feel small because you've left the environment where you were fluent, emotionally and linguistically. Americans around me didn't look confident because they were superior. They looked confident because the system was built for them. I was learning to live inside it. Once that idea settled, I stopped measuring my days by fluency. I measured them by exposure. Did I hear English today? Yes. Did I speak even one imperfect sentence? Yes. Did I survive the discomfort? Yes. That was enough. Comparison didn't disappear, but it softened. And in that softer space, something else appeared, curiosity. Not about being better than others, but about understanding them. That curiosity would later reshape how I learned English, how I built relationships, and how I saw my place in this country. But before that growth could really begin, there was one challenge I still couldn't avoid. English itself, every single day. English as a daily struggle. English didn't attack me all at once. It showed up every morning, quietly, like a bill you didn't remember signing up for, but still had to pay. On the bus. At the grocery store. In casual conversations that started and ended before I could fully join them. The struggle wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive. And that's what made it exhausting. People often imagine language learning as a staircase, step by step, higher and higher. In reality, It felt more like a treadmill. A lot of effort, very little visible movement. And every time I looked to the side, it seemed like everyone else was running faster without sweating. That's when comparison really dug in. Someone spoke English with an accent, but confidently. Someone else used jokes I didn't understand. A coworker apologized for their bad English, even though it sounded perfect to me. My brain turned those moments into silent judgments. They're better than you. They're more natural. You're slower. Linguists explain that adult language learners don't just learn words, they constantly monitor themselves. Pronunciation, grammar, tone. That's self-monitoring. Uses working memory, which is limited. When working memory is overloaded, fluency drops. In simple terms, the more you judge yourself while speaking, the worse you speak. And I judged myself constantly. Ordering food felt like performing on stage. Phone calls were the worst. No facial clues. No time to prepare. Just voices moving too fast. I avoided them whenever possible. Instead, I rehearsed. I practiced sentences alone. I spoke to myself while cooking, while driving, while doing laundry. I need an appointment. I'm calling about my bill. Can you repeat that, please? The irony was painful. Alone, my English sounded fine. Around people, it disappeared. Psychology calls this evaluation anxiety. When you believe you're being judged, your stress response activates. Heart rate up. Muscles tense. Breath shallow. Your brain shifts from learning mode to survival mode. Survival mode doesn't care about grammar. That's why even simple sentences fell apart when I needed them most. I remember one afternoon at a store. The cashier asked a question I didn't catch. I asked her to repeat it. She did, slightly faster. I froze. Not because the English was impossible. Because comparison was louder than comprehension. Everyone behind me waited. I felt their patience ticking away. My face grew warm. My mind went blank. Eventually, I nodded and hoped for the best. Walking out, I felt something heavier than embarrassment. I felt defeated. At home, I opened social media and saw language learners sharing milestones. I finally sound native. My brain translated it instantly. You don't. Comparison doesn't motivate the way we think it does. Research shows it often reduces intrinsic motivation, the desire to learn for yourself. Instead, it replaces curiosity with pressure. Pressure makes you rigid. Rigid minds don't absorb language well. I started noticing how often I measured myself. After conversations. After listening practice. Even after watching movies. How much did you understand? Why didn't you catch that joke? Others would get it. English stopped being a tool. It became a scoreboard. And the score was never high enough. One night, frustrated, I searched for explanations. Not grammar rules, reasons. Why did English feel heavier here than back home, even though I studied more? The answer was uncomfortable. Identity. In my native language, I was expressive, funny, thoughtful. In English, I was basic, careful, reduced. That gap hurt. Sociolinguists say language carries identity. When you lose fluency, you temporarily lose parts of yourself. Comparison deepens that loss because you're constantly reminded of who you used to be versus who you are now. I wasn't just learning English. I was grieving a version of myself. Once I saw that, the struggle made more sense. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't lack of intelligence. It was emotional weight. The daily struggle wasn't about vocabulary, it was about courage. The courage to sound incomplete. To speak before you're ready. To exist publicly in an unfinished form. Most people around me had never experienced that. They weren't braver. They were just at home. That realization didn't magically fix my English. But it softened the comparison. Instead of asking, why am I worse? I started asking, what am I practicing today? Listening became exposure, not evaluation. Speaking became participation, not performance. I still struggled. Every day. But the struggle stopped feeling like proof of failure. It felt like movement. And slowly, very slowly, English stopped being an enemy I fought daily. It became a companion that walked with me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but always teaching. That shift would open the door to something unexpected. Because once English stopped defining my worth, it finally made space for connection. And that's where the story really began to change. Love in a foreign language. Love didn't arrive with perfect timing or clear grammar. It entered my life in broken sentences, awkward pauses, and moments where silence said more than English ever could. We met in an ordinary way, nothing cinematic. A shared space, a casual introduction, a few polite words exchanged slowly. My brain worked twice as hard as my heart. Listen. Translate. Respond. Smile. That rhythm became familiar. Romantic movies make love sound fluent. Real love, especially across cultures, sounds uncertain. What did you mean? Can you say that again? No, I meant emotionally, not literally. English sat between us, not as a wall, but not quite a bridge either. At first, I compared again. Of course I did. I compared myself to people who flirted easily, to couples who joked fast and finished each other's sentences, to versions of myself I used to be in my native language, witty, relaxed, emotionally precise. With her, I was slower, softer, less impressive. And my brain whispered, she deserves someone easier. Psychologists say romantic connection relies heavily on perceived competence, how capable we feel expressing ourselves. When language limits expression, self-worth often drops. Not because love is weaker, but because confidence is. Dates felt like listening exams. I focused so much on understanding words that I sometimes missed emotions. Tone mattered more than vocabulary, but tone was harder to decode. She noticed my pauses, my careful sentences. She never rushed me. That scared me more than impatience would have. Comparison showed up in subtle ways. Why couldn't I tell stories smoothly? Why did jokes land late, or not at all? Why did I like you feel heavier in English than it ever did before? There's a concept in linguistics called emotional distance. Emotions expressed in a second language often feel less intense, not because they are weaker, but because the brain processes them differently. That distance can protect you. It can also make you feel fake. I worried my feelings sounded smaller than they really were. One evening, we talked about families. I struggled to explain mine, values, closeness, history. Words felt thin. I stopped mid-sentence, frustrated. She waited, then said, "It's okay. I get it." That moment mattered. Love doesn't always need full sentences. Sometimes it needs patience. Still, comparison didn't leave. I watched how effortlessly she connected with others. How easily she navigated conversations. I felt like I was always catching up, emotionally translating myself. Sociologists note that intercultural relationships often amplify self-awareness. You don't just see yourself through your partner's eyes, you see yourself through an entire culture's lens. Every difference feels louder. Food choices, humor, holidays, even silence meant different things. At times, I wondered if love required fluency I didn't have yet. Arguments were the hardest. Not the emotional ones, the practical ones. Misunderstandings multiplied when language slowed down. Clarifying feelings took twice the effort. My brain panicked. If I can't explain myself, I'll lose this. That fear fueled comparison again. Others can express emotions clearly. Others don't need to stop and search for words. Others are easier to love. But something unexpected happened over time. Because I spoke slowly, I listened deeply. Because I chose words carefully, I meant them. Because I couldn't rely on charm, I relied on presence. Love adjusted. Neuroscience shows that emotional bonding strengthens through consistent safety, not verbal perfection. Reassurance, tone, and reliability matter more than vocabulary size. My English wasn't fluent, but my actions were. I showed up. I listened. I stayed. One night, I apologized for my English again. She looked at me and said, "You explain things differently." Not worse. Just differently. That sentence shifted something. Maybe love didn't need comparison. Maybe it needed translation. Not of words, but of expectations. I stopped trying to sound impressive. I started trying to be honest. I don't know how to say this well. This is important to me. I'm still learning. Those sentences were simple. They worked. Slowly, English became part of our relationship, not an obstacle, but a shared space of growth. We learned each other's rhythms. We learned when silence meant comfort, not distance. Love in a foreign language taught me something. Language classes never did. Connection isn't about speed. It's about intention. And for the first time since arriving in the US, comparison lost some of its power. Because love didn't ask me to be fluent. It asked me to be present. Still, love was only one part of the story. Marriage would raise the stakes even higher, and comparison would return in new forms. Marriage and invisible pressure. Marriage didn't arrive like a celebration that lasted forever. It arrived like a quiet agreement with a long list of expectations no one handed me. The paperwork was clear. The culture was not. Suddenly, love was no longer just between two people. It was reflected in families, neighbors, coworkers, and casual conversations that began with, "So, how's married life?" Each question sounded friendly. Each one carried an invisible measuring tape. I compared again. In the US, marriage often looked efficient from the outside. Two people. Two careers, shared calendars, clear roles. At least, that was the image I saw. We were still learning each other's rhythms. Still translating habits. Still negotiating silence and space. And my English, still careful, still slower, became part of that pressure. Psychologists call this role strain. When expectations change faster than skills or confidence, stress rises. Marriage shifted my role overnight, from individual learner to partner, sometimes spokesperson. Phone calls, appointments, forms. English wasn't optional anymore. I compared how easily other couples handled life logistics. They joked with doctors. They argued confidently in public. They sounded settled. I felt like a guest in my own marriage sometimes, present, committed, but unsure of the rules. Family gatherings made comparison louder. Small talk moved fast. Stories overlapped. Laughter came quickly. I smiled. I nodded. I filled gaps with silence. Someone asked, "So how did you two meet?" I knew the story. I loved the story. Telling it in English felt like retelling it through fog. That hurt more than I expected. Language doesn't just communicate facts, it communicates belonging. When you struggle to tell your own story, you feel disconnected from it. Research in cross-cultural marriages shows that the partner who adapts linguistically often experiences higher emotional fatigue. You're constantly monitoring tone, meaning, and interpretation, not just for yourself, but for the relationship. I carried that weight quietly. At home, I replayed conversations. Why didn't I say that better? Why didn't I explain myself clearly? Why do other couples seem so relaxed? Comparison again. Social media didn't help. Photos of smiling couples. Posts about milestones. Captions full of confidence. My brain filled in what I couldn't see. They're happier. They're doing it right. Marriage is already a mirror. In a foreign culture, it becomes a magnifying glass. Arguments felt heavier. Not because we fought more, but because resolution took longer. Misunderstandings lingered when language slowed down clarification. I worried constantly. If I can't express myself fully, will I be misunderstood forever? That fear turned small moments into big ones. Neuroscience explains that under relational stress, the brain looks for certainty. Comparison offers fake certainty by ranking you against others. It doesn't solve problems, it just gives anxiety a shape. One evening, overwhelmed, I said something simple to my partner. I feel behind. Not in love. In life. She listened. She didn't interrupt. Then she said, "Behind who?" That question stopped me. Behind who exactly? Behind couples I didn't actually know. Behind conversations I only partially understood. Behind an imaginary timeline built from observation, not reality. That night, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't comparing marriages. I was comparing performances. What looked like ease on the outside wasn't proof of happiness. It was proof of familiarity with the system. Marriage didn't require me to catch up. It required me to show up. I started doing something different. Instead of apologizing for my English, I explained my process. Instead of staying silent, I asked for time. I need a second to think. I want to say this carefully. This matters to me. Those phrases slowed conversations, but they deepened them. Studies show that relational satisfaction increases when partners feel psychologically safe, not linguistically perfect. Safety allows vulnerability. Vulnerability builds trust. Slowly, pressure shifted. I stopped assuming other couples had it figured out. I stopped measuring our relationship against theirs. I started measuring it against our values. Were we honest? Were we kind? Were we growing? English became a shared responsibility, not a private burden. I still struggled. In public spaces, I still compared sometimes. But marriage taught me something comparison never could. Progress isn't visible. It's lived. By letting go of how things should look, I made space for how they actually felt. That shift didn't erase pressure, but it made it manageable. And as marriage settled into something real, imperfect, human, and ours, another force quietly entered the picture. One that would test comparison in an even deeper way. Family. Social media and quiet envy. Social media didn't shout at me. It smiled. Scrolling felt harmless at first. A few minutes while waiting. A quick check before bed. Photos of people I barely knew living lives that looked strangely complete. New jobs. Clear English captions. Happy couples. Confident opinions typed without hesitation. And just like that, comparison found a new, more efficient vehicle. This time, it didn't need weather or culture or real conversations. It lived in my pocket. I told myself I was just staying connected. But my nervous system knew better. Neuroscientists explain that the brain doesn't fully distinguish between real social environments and digital ones. When you see faces, stories, success markers, your brain treats them as social signals. Signals invite comparison automatically. Who's ahead? Who's doing better? Who belongs? I watched people who arrived in the US after me write fluent posts. I saw immigrants joke confidently in English, gaining likes and approval. I saw families smiling in matching outfits, captions full of gratitude and clarity. My English felt slow again. My life felt unpolished. Quiet envy doesn't feel like jealousy. It feels like inadequacy wrapped in politeness. You don't wish others to fail. You just wonder why it seems easier for them. Psychology calls this upward social comparison. Comparing yourself to people you perceive as more successful. In small doses, it can motivate. In constant exposure, it drains. I didn't comment much. I didn't post often. I consumed. Consumption without context is dangerous. Because social media removes friction. You don't see pauses, doubt, or repetition. You see results. Your brain fills in the gaps with fantasy. They're fluent because they're talented. They're happy because they figured it out. They're confident because they're different from you. That story felt convincing. It was wrong. Late at night, after scrolling, I noticed my thoughts shift. Why am I still struggling with listening? Why do I hesitate before speaking? Why does my life feel slower? The next day, my English felt heavier. Not worse, just heavier. Studies show that frequent social media comparison increases anxiety and reduces self-efficacy, the belief that you can improve. When you don't believe improvement is possible, effort feels pointless. That's when learning quietly stalls. I still practiced, but the joy was gone. English became something I measured publicly, even when no one was watching. A performance in my own head. One evening, I caught myself rewriting a simple caption 5 times. Not to be clear, to be impressive. That moment bothered me. Language learning had shifted again. From communication to validation. I remembered something cognitive scientists say: the brain learns best when attention is inward, not evaluative. Comparison pulls attention outward. Always checking. Always ranking. I didn't quit social media. I did something smaller. I paid attention to how my body felt after scrolling. tight chest, shallow breathing, urgency. Then I paid attention. After real conversations, even awkward ones, calmer, more grounded, present. That contrast mattered. I started muting accounts, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Not because others were wrong, but because my nervous system was tired. I also noticed something honest. People who posted the most about confidence often spoke privately about doubt. People who sounded fluent online still apologized in person. The gap between appearance and reality was wide. Sociologists call this curated identity. We don't lie, we select. And selection creates illusion. Once I saw that, envy softened into understanding. I stopped asking, why am I behind? I started asking, what am I actually doing today? Listening for 10 minutes. Speaking one imperfect sentence. Living my real life instead of observing edited ones. That shift mattered more than any productivity tip. My English didn't suddenly improve, but my relationship with it did. Comparison lost some of its fuel when it lost constant input. I also realized something deeper. Social media had trained me to compare outcomes. Language learning happens in process. Those two don't mix well. Process is slow, repetitive, unglamorous. Outcomes look clean. When you judge process by outcome standards, you always feel behind. Quiet envy taught me that. One night, I deleted an app for a week. Not forever. Just a pause. During that week, English felt lighter. Not easier, but less judged. I spoke more. I hesitated less. I laughed at mistakes. Neuroscience would say my threat response decreased. I would say my shoulders dropped. Comparison didn't disappear. It never fully does. But it stopped running the show. And in that quieter mental space, something new appeared, not confidence. Yet, but neutrality. English became something I used, not something I displayed. That neutrality would soon be tested again. Because life doesn't stop asking new questions. The next one would be louder, more permanent, and impossible to scroll away from. It would come with responsibility. And with children. The moment I felt exhausted. Exhaustion didn't arrive dramatically. It didn't come with tears or loud frustration. It showed up as a quiet numbness, the kind that makes even simple things feel heavy. I noticed it one morning while listening to English on my phone. A familiar routine. Slow audio. Clear pronunciation. Normally, I focused. That day, the sounds passed through me. Without sticking. My brain wasn't confused. It was tired. Not physically. Mentally. Psychologists call this cognitive fatigue. It happens when sustained effort meets constant self-evaluation. Learning English had become both. Every sentence was work. Every conversation was monitoring. Every mistake was replayed. Comparison had turned learning into labor. I still did everything right. I listened daily. I practiced speaking. I exposed myself to English. But something was missing: energy. Motivation researchers explain that burnout often appears not when effort is low, but when effort feels disconnected from meaning. You keep moving, but you don't know why anymore. That's where I was. I sat in the car one afternoon, engine off, phone in my hand, listening to a podcast I used to enjoy. The speaker laughed. The joke landed somewhere around my brain, but I didn't laugh. Instead, I thought others would understand this better. That sentence again. Comparison had become automatic. No emotion attached. Just habit. That scared me. Burnout isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the absence of reaction. No excitement. No frustration. Just neutrality. That leans toward quitting. I asked myself a question I had avoided for months. What if I stopped trying so hard? The idea felt like failure, but also like relief. Neuroscience offers a useful concept. Here, the brain needs recovery cycles. Without them, learning systems degrade. Rest isn't optional. Neither is meaning. I realized I hadn't rested from comparison, even on easy days. My brain was ranking progress, speed, accent, confidence. Always checking. I compared myself to immigrants who sounded fluent, to parents who navigated schools easily, to coworkers who joked freely. No wonder I was tired. One evening, after a long day, my partner asked how my English practice was going. I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I didn't know how I felt. That pause mattered. I finally said, I think I'm exhausted from proving something. Proving progress. Proving worth. Proving that I belonged. Psychologists describe this as performance-based identity. When self-worth depends on visible improvement, rest feels unsafe. You don't stop because stopping feels like disappearing. But here's the quiet truth. Exhaustion is information. It tells you something is misaligned. That night, I didn't practice. I didn't listen. I didn't repeat sentences. I went for a walk instead. Cold air. Quiet streets. No input. Just movement. For the first time in a long while, English wasn't present. And something interesting happened. I missed it. Not the pressure. The curiosity. I missed understanding new words. I missed the moment when meaning clicked. I missed using language, not measuring it. That contrast was clear. The problem wasn't English. It was comparison. Research on motivation shows that autonomy, choosing how and why you learn, restores energy. Comparison removes autonomy. It turns learning into compliance. I had been learning against others, not for myself. The next day, I tried something small. I listened to English without subtitles. Not to understand everything, just to hear rhythm. No pausing. No judging. It felt strange. Liberating. I didn't track comprehension. I didn't test myself. I just listened. That simple shift lowered the noise in my head. Comparison feeds on data. Less data, less comparison. I also changed how I spoke. Instead of correcting myself mid-sentence, I finished the thought. Instead of apologizing for mistakes, I acknowledged them and moved on. I mean, sorry, let me say that again. Normal. Human. Burnout began to loosen its grip. Not because I worked harder. Because I stopped carrying unnecessary weight. The exhaustion didn't vanish overnight. But it changed texture. It became signal. Not obstacle. I understood something important then. Comparison doesn't just steal joy. It steals endurance. You can push through confusion. You can push through discomfort. But constant self-judgment drains even the strongest motivation. That realization marked a turning point. Not a breakthrough. A boundary. I decided I would no longer use exhaustion as proof of failure. I would use it as instruction. Slow down. Refocus. Return to meaning. English didn't need me to be relentless. It needed me to be present. That moment, quiet, unremarkable, changed the direction of my learning. Because once exhaustion was acknowledged, something else became possible. Understanding. And that understanding would soon reshape how I saw comparison itself. Understanding the comparison trap. The moment exhaustion faded enough for me to think clearly, one question stayed in my mind. Why did comparison feel so automatic, so convincing, even when it made everything worse? The answer wasn't personal. It was biological. The human brain evolved to survive in groups, long before language apps and social media. Comparison helped our ancestors assess risk. Who was stronger? Who had more resources? Who belonged? Comparison wasn't designed to make you happy. It was designed to keep you alert. Modern life never told the brain it could relax. Neuroscientists explain that the brain constantly predicts outcomes. When it lacks clear information, it fills gaps using social cues. In a new country, new language, and new culture, gaps are everywhere. So the brain scans others. How fast they speak. How confidently they move. How little effort they seem to use. Your brain treats these observations as data, even when they're incomplete. Here's the trap. The brain compares your private process to other people's public behavior. That's not a fair comparison. But fairness isn't the brain's goal. Efficiency is. I realized comparison had become my brain's shortcut for uncertainty. Instead of asking, what do I need right now, it asked, where do I rank? Ranking feels productive. It isn't. Psychologists call this relative evaluation. It creates an illusion of control. If you know your position, you feel oriented even if the position hurts. This explained why comparison stuck around even when it exhausted me. It gave my brain a sense of order. Understanding that changed how I treated it. Instead of fighting comparison, I observed it. Every time the thought appeared, they're better than me, I paused. Not to argue. Just to notice. Cognitive behavioral research shows that naming a mental pattern reduces its emotional power. You stop being inside the thought. You stand next to it. I started labeling quietly. Comparison. Ranking. Threat response. That simple naming slowed the spiral. I also learned something surprising from motivation science. The brain learns best when progress is self-referenced, not other-referenced. Comparing today to yesterday builds momentum. Comparing yourself to others drains it. The brain doesn't care who's ahead. It cares whether you are moving. Once I saw comparison as a tool, not a truth, I could choose when to use it. Most of the time, I didn't need it. I also noticed how comparison distorted time. Someone fluent seemed ahead, but I didn't know their timeline. Years of exposure. Childhood immersion. Emotional safety. I was comparing my Chapter 1 to someone else's. Chapter 10. That mismatch explained a lot of my frustration. Neuroscience calls this temporal compression. The brain collapses long processes into short impressions. You see the outcome and assume the path was short. It rarely is. Understanding this helped me reclaim patience. Not patience as virtue, but patience as accuracy. I wasn't slow. I was early. Another insight came from developmental psychology. Humans develop skills in bursts, not lines. Plateaus aren't failure, they're integration periods. Comparison ignores plateaus. It only values visible acceleration. once I stopped panicking. During plateaus, my energy returned. I also examined when comparison felt strongest. Usually when I was tired, hungry, overstimulated. Physical state amplified mental habits. This mattered. Instead of asking, why am I comparing again? I asked, what does my body need? Sleep, food, quiet. Meeting those needs reduced comparison without mental effort. I learned to redirect comparison into curiosity. Instead of they speak better, I asked, what exposure might they have had? Instead of I'm behind, I asked, what's one thing I can practice today? This wasn't positive thinking. It was realistic thinking. Comparison thrives on vagueness. Clarity weakens it. Slowly, the trap became visible. And visible traps are easier to avoid. English learning shifted again, not in method, but in mindset. I stopped expecting linear improvement. I stopped using others as benchmarks. I stopped interpreting difficulty as deficiency. Difficulty meant complexity. Complexity meant growth. That understanding didn't eliminate comparison forever. It changed its role. Comparison became a signal. A reminder to return to self-reference. When I caught myself ranking, I asked one question. What is my actual task right now? Listen. Speak. Rest. Connect. Simple. Specific. Grounded. This approach didn't just help my English. It changed how I experience life in the US. Less urgency. Less self-surveillance. More presence. And presence opens space for something unexpected. Joy. Not loud joy. Quiet joy. The kind that appears when you stop measuring yourself against imaginary standards. That joy would soon attach itself to small actions, habits that slowly rebuilt confidence without comparison. Those habits would be simple, almost boring, and they would change everything. Small changes, new perspective. Change didn't arrive as motivation. It arrived as permission. Permission to stop fixing everything at once. Permission to stop turning English into a test I had to pass every day. After understanding how comparison worked, I didn't feel inspired. I felt practical. If the brain learned through safety and self-reference, then small changes mattered more than big promises. So I made them small. Almost boring. The first change was time. I stopped timing my practice. No more 30 minutes minimum. No more tracking streaks like my worth depended on consistency. Research on habit formation shows that rigid goals increase dropout rates, while flexible routines increase persistence. My brain didn't need discipline. It needed trust. Some days I listened for 5 minutes. Some days 20. Some days not at all. And nothing collapsed. The second change was input quality. I chose English I liked, not English I thought I should consume. Stories instead of news. Conversations instead of lectures. Real voices over perfect pronunciation. Motivation science calls this intrinsic alignment. When learning matches personal interest, effort feels lighter. I wasn't chasing improvement anymore. I was following curiosity. The third change was speaking without repair. I used to correct myself mid-sentence. Stop. Restart. Apologize. Now, I finish thoughts, even if they were messy. Linguistic research shows that fluency improves when speakers prioritize message over accuracy. Accuracy catches up later. I let that happen. Mistakes stopped being emergencies. They became texture. I also changed how I listened. Instead of asking, "Did I understand everything?" I asked, "Did I understand enough?" Enough to respond. Enough to feel connected. Enough to keep going. Partial comprehension became acceptable. That shift alone reduced mental pressure. Comparison thrives on perfection. Progress thrives on sufficiency. Another small change. I spoke English daily, but predictably. Same cafe. Same cashier. Same route. Predictability reduces cognitive load. When the environment is stable, the brain focuses on language, not survival. I stopped throwing myself into random conversations just to challenge myself. Consistency replaced intensity. I also gave myself language. Anchors. Simple phrases I could rely on when my brain froze. Let me think for a second. Can you say that more slowly? I want to make sure I understand. Those phrases weren't signs of weakness. They were tools. Having them reduced panic. Reduced panic reduced comparison. Over time, these small changes accumulated. Not dramatically. Quietly. One day, I realized I had a full conversation. Without replaying it afterward. Another day, I laughed at a joke in real time. Another day, I forgot to compare myself altogether. Perspective shifted. I stopped asking, "Am I good at English?" I started asking, "Is English working for me today?" That question respected reality. Some days yes. Some days no. Both were allowed. Cognitive psychologists say mastery emerges when learners stop monitoring themselves excessively. Skill becomes automatic when attention moves outward. My attention had finally shifted. I also noticed how these changes affected other areas of life. Conversations felt less like performance. Relationships felt less strained. Even silence felt less threatening. English was no longer the center of my identity. It was a part of my environment. That mattered. Comparison had fed on the idea that English defined my value. Removing that belief starved it. I didn't celebrate milestones publicly. I didn't announce progress. I lived it. And living it felt lighter. There was still effort. Still confusion. Still fatigue sometimes. But the emotional tone changed. Learning felt companionable, not adversarial. I was no longer chasing a future version of myself who spoke perfectly. I was working with the version I had today. That collaboration built confidence quietly. Not the loud kind. The stable kind. The kind that doesn't need evidence. These small changes didn't make me fluent overnight. They made me consistent without force. And consistency without force is powerful. Because it creates room for something deeper than progress. Acceptance. Acceptance didn't mean giving up. It meant stopping the fight with reality. Once I accepted my pace, my accent, my process, I stopped leaking energy into comparison. That energy went somewhere else. Into listening. Into connecting. Into living. And as English settled into my life this way, steady, imperfect, functional, it became ready to carry heavier things. Stories. Responsibility. Family. The next shift would test everything I had learned so far. Because learning English for yourself is one thing. Learning it for others changes the rules entirely. Family, children, and acceptance. Responsibility has a way of changing your relationship with language. Not suddenly. Gradually. Quietly. And then all at once. Family life in the United States didn't wait for my English to feel ready. It arrived with schedules, forms, school emails, pediatric appointments, and conversations that mattered too much to postpone. English was no longer something I practiced. It was something I used on behalf of people I loved. That shift brought comparison back, but in a different shape. I compared how other parents spoke with teachers, how confidently they asked questions, how easily they navigated systems that still felt foreign to me. I worried less about sounding smart and more about sounding clear. Misunderstanding wasn't embarrassing anymore. It was risky. Psychologists call this role expansion. When your identity expands, parent, caregiver, advocate, language becomes a tool for protection. Pressure increases. So does fear of getting it wrong. At school events, conversations moved fast. Acronyms, policies, casual jokes layered with information. I listened carefully, holding pieces together. I understood most of it. I still felt behind. Comparison whispered again. Other parents look so relaxed. They don't double-check every word. They belong here. Parenthood has a way of exposing insecurities you thought you outgrew. At home, children absorbed English effortlessly. They picked up pronunciation, slang, rhythm without effort. I compared again. They learned so fast. Why did it take me so long? Developmental psychology offers a simple answer. Children's brains are wired for language acquisition. Adults' brains are wired for efficiency. Different systems. Different timelines. Knowing that helped, but didn't erase the feeling. Then something unexpected happened. My children asked questions. Not about grammar. About meaning. What does that word feel like? Why do people say it that way? Is that polite or not? Suddenly, English wasn't a test. It was a shared exploration. I explained what I knew. I admitted what I didn't. We learned together. Family psychologists note that shared learning builds connection more effectively than modeled perfection. Children don't need flawless parents. They need present ones. That idea softened comparison. Further, I stopped trying to hide my accent. I stopped apologizing for my pace. I modeled curiosity instead. I'm not sure. Let's find out. That's a good question. I learned that later than you. Those sentences felt honest. At home, English became layered. School English. Home English. Emotion English. I realized something important. Fluency isn't one thing. You can be fluent in love before you're fluent in paperwork. You can be fluent in care before you're fluent in policy language. Accepting that changed how I evaluated myself. Comparison had insisted on a single standard. Family life revealed many. I still prepared before meetings. I still wrote notes. I still asked for clarification. But I no longer saw those as weaknesses. They were strategies. Cognitive science supports this. Effective learners use external supports. Notes, repetition, clarification requests reduce cognitive load. Native speakers do this too. They just don't call it learning. I watched other parents struggle in different ways. Time, patience, emotional regulation. Everyone had gaps. Language was mine. That realization leveled the field. One evening after a long day, my child corrected my pronunciation. Gently, casually. We laughed. There was no shame, only reality. That moment felt symbolic. English was no longer a hierarchy. It was a tool moving through generations. Acceptance settled in quietly. I accepted that my children would outpace me linguistically. I accepted that my English would always carry history. I accepted that clarity mattered more than elegance. This acceptance didn't reduce effort. It reduced resistance. I stopped asking, do I sound like I belong? I started asking, am I understood? Most days, the answer was yes. Family life demanded presence more than performance. It didn't reward comparison. It rewarded consistency. Show up. Ask questions. Advocate. Listen. Those actions didn't require perfect English. They required courage. And courage grows when comparison loosens its grip. Slowly, English became woven into daily life without ceremony. Morning routines. Bedtime stories. School notes pinned to the fridge. It wasn't impressive. It was real. And real use built real confidence. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that shows up when needed. By accepting my role, not as the most fluent speaker, but as a capable one, I reclaimed energy comparison had stolen. That energy went into connection. Connection built meaning. Meaning made English lighter. Family didn't erase comparison. It reframed it. I no longer compared to feel superior or inferior. I compared to understand context and then moved on. That shift prepared me for the final lesson. One that would tie everything together. Because once acceptance settles in, joy has space to return. English as a personal story. English stopped feeling like a subject the day it started sounding like my life. Not polished. Not impressive. But real. Somewhere between family routines, school emails, and ordinary conversations, I noticed a shift. I was no longer asking, how good is my English? I was asking, what am I trying to say? That difference mattered more than any technique. Language teachers often talk about ownership. When learners stop borrowing sentences and start shaping meaning from their own experience, fluency changes texture. It becomes personal. For a long time, my English had been borrowed. Borrowed phrases. Borrowed confidence. Borrowed timelines. I spoke the way I thought learners should speak. But my life didn't fit those sentences. So I started telling my story in English, not dramatically, not publicly, just honestly. To friends. To coworkers. To myself. Simple things. Where I came from. What confused me. What I missed. What I loved about being here. Those stories weren't efficient. They were mine. Narrative psychology explains that humans understand themselves through stories. When you tell your story in a new language, you're not just translating words, you're rebuilding identity. That takes time. I stopped trying to sound neutral. I let my accent carry history. I let pauses show thought. Comparison had less room here. You can't compare stories the same way you compare skills. Stories aren't ranked. They're received. I noticed how people listened differently when I spoke from experience instead of correctness. They asked questions. They waited. They connected. English responded. It became more flexible. More forgiving. I also changed how I practiced. Instead of drills, I narrated my day. While cooking. While driving. While cleaning. This reminds me of home. I didn't expect that. This was harder than I thought. These sentences weren't advanced. They were meaningful. Cognitive science shows that emotionally relevant language is remembered more easily. The brain prioritizes meaning over form. My vocabulary grew naturally, not because I memorized more, but because I needed more. Comparison faded again. I wasn't trying to match anyone's English. I was trying to express my life. Even mistakes felt different. They didn't feel like failure. They felt like approximation. Sociolinguists say second language speakers often develop translanguaging, a fluid movement between languages, cultures, and identities. It's not broken language. It's expanded language. Once I saw that, I stopped correcting my inner voice so harshly. I also noticed something unexpected. When I told my story honestly, others shared theirs. Immigration stories, adjustment struggles, quiet fears. Everyone had something unfinished. That realization dismantled comparison further. People weren't ahead. They were just different chapters. English became a bridge instead of a barrier. Not perfect, but functional enough to carry weight. I stopped waiting to be fluent before speaking about important things. Grief, love, doubt, hope. Those conversations mattered too much to delay. Psychologists note that self-expression increases perceived confidence. When you feel heard, confidence follows naturally. Not instantly, but steadily. I felt that shift. My English didn't suddenly sound native, but it sounded true. Truth has its own fluency. I also realized something simple. Comparison thrives on abstraction. Stories are concrete. When you live inside your own narrative, others' timelines lose power. I wasn't behind. I was becoming. English became part of that becoming, not the measure of it. I stopped introducing myself as still learning English. I started saying I use English every day. That sentence felt accurate. Learning didn't stop. It deepened. The language grew with my life instead of racing ahead of it. Looking back, this was the quiet turning point. Not the day I spoke well. The day I spoke as myself. That choice reshaped everything. Because once English belonged to my story, comparison no longer defined it. And when comparison loses its grip, something else becomes possible. Joy, not as achievement, but as presence. The final chapter wasn't about mastery. It was about letting go. Stopping comparison, finding joy. Joy didn't arrive when my English became good enough. It arrived when I stopped asking whether it was good enough at all. The change was subtle. Almost disappointing if you expected fireworks. No dramatic moment. No clear finish line. Just a quiet realization one ordinary day, I wasn't measuring myself anymore. I noticed it while speaking. English on the phone. A normal call. Some hesitation. A few pauses. And no inner voice ranking the performance afterward. That silence was new. Comparison had trained my brain to review every interaction like a recording. What went wrong? What others would have said better? Where I fell short? Now, the call simply ended. And life moved on. Psychologists describe joy not as excitement, but as ease. The absence of constant self-monitoring. Ease creates space. Space allows contentment. For years, comparison had convinced me that joy was conditional. After fluency. After confidence. After catching up. But comparison never tells you when you've arrived. It just moves the goalpost. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped negotiating with it. I didn't fight comparison anymore. I didn't try to eliminate it. I just stopped listening. The voice still appeared sometimes. When someone spoke beautifully. When I struggled with a word. When I felt tired. But it no longer sounded authoritative. It sounded familiar and outdated. Neuroscience would say my brain rewired through repeated experiences of safety and self-reference. I would say I learned to trust my own pace. Joy showed up in small places. Laughing at a joke even if I didn't catch every word. Speaking without preparing a script. Letting silence exist without panic. Those moments weren't impressive. They were freeing. I realized something important about comparison. It pretends to protect you from disappointment. In reality, it delays satisfaction. As long as you're comparing, you're waiting. Waiting to be better. Waiting to be enough. Waiting to enjoy where you are. Stopping comparison didn't make my life perfect. It made it available. English became part of that availability. I used it to connect, not to prove. To participate, not to perform. My accent remained. My pace remained. So did my life. And that life felt full. Sociologists talk about belonging as an internal decision, not an external validation. You don't belong because others approve. You belong because you stay. I stayed. In conversations. In relationships. In this country. Comparison had once convinced me I was temporary. Stopping comparison allowed me to feel rooted. I stopped asking, do I sound like them? I asked, am I understood? Most of the time, yes. And when not, clarification worked better than self-judgment ever had. Looking back, the question from the title finally answered itself. Can comparison steal joy? Yes. Quietly. Consistently. Convincingly. But joy isn't stolen forever. It returns the moment comparison loses its role. The day I stopped comparing myself, English didn't magically improve. My relationship with it did. Learning felt lighter. Living felt steadier. I didn't become fluent overnight. I became present. That was enough. If you're listening to this while struggling with English, especially in a place that doesn't feel like home yet, know this. Your pace is not a problem. Your accent is not a flaw. Your story is not behind. Comparison will try to convince you otherwise. It always does. You don't need to win against it. You just need to stop obeying it. Speak imperfectly. Listen patiently. Live fully. Language grows best in environments where joy is allowed. And joy grows where comparison ends. That's the real practice. Not perfect English. A real life, spoken slowly, honestly, and without apology. And maybe this story doesn't really end here. Because comparison doesn't disappear forever. It comes back quietly. In a new place. With a new voice. But now you recognize it. You know that your English is not a race. Your life is not behind. And your journey does not need permission to be meaningful. Slow English is not weak English. It is thoughtful English. It is human English. Every pause you take. Every simple sentence you speak. Every time you listen carefully instead of rushing. You are building something real. If this story felt familiar, you are not alone. There are many more stories like this. Stories about language, life, identity, and quiet growth in a foreign country. On this channel, we don't chase perfection. We practice calm. We learn English. Slowly, clearly, and honestly through real-life stories. So if you want to improve your listening, reading, and speaking English without pressure, if you want English that feels natural, peaceful, and useful in daily life, this channel is for you. Subscribe now to join our slow English journey. Like the video if this story touched you. Leave a comment and tell me which part of the story felt like your own. The next story may answer a question you haven't asked yet. And it starts very soon. See you in the next video.